So this is the My Last Duchess socio-historical context and structure video. So some of the themes that we've got up here, let's just get started, are power, class, jealousy, possessiveness, arrogance, communication, and death. And as you can see, I couldn't fit the whole poem, so I've got the first half, I would say, of the poem, maybe less than half. But if you just open up your text as a point of reference, that will be really helpful to point out the bits of the poem which match up with the themes, which may not be here in this extract. So let's just begin. So the first theme I've got here, which actually the first two themes I've got here, which kind of interlink with each other and seem pretty obvious, are power and class. Obviously, the poem is from the point of view of the Duke, and he's actually known as the Duke of Ferrara, and it's his dramatic monologue. We'll talk a little bit about what the dramatic monologue means in terms of the structure of the poem itself, but it's basically the Duke of Ferrara speaking, and he's actually speaking to the servant of his future father-in-law. So he's actually, if you look at near the end of the poem, line 49, he actually says, "The Count, your master's known munificence, is ample warrant that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self as I avowed." And basically what he's saying there, it's revealed, is that the Duke, who has been talking about his last Duchess, actually is talking to the servant of his future father-in-law, the servant of the man whose daughter he intends to marry, and he actually asks for a dowry. And obviously we get the sense that because the Duke of Ferrara is a duke and he's so high in power and class, that he is probably, very high up. Well, most definitely he is very high up in class, and so whoever he chooses to marry will obviously be quite rich and powerful as well. But as we read the poem, we realise that the Duke, yes, indeed, is very powerful and high in class, to the point where he is incredibly disturbing, and he actually turns out to be a very, very evil man, and it's implied that he actually murdered his Duchess. But before we start all that, looking at class and power, it is important to note that although this poem is actually a historical poem, so it's actually based off a real duke who was caught up in a murder conspiracy that maybe he poisoned his wife, and that was in the 1500s. This poem was by Robert Browning, first of all, and we're going to go into a little bit about him in the later slides, and it was published in 1842. So it was written in the mid-1800s, and that was mid-Victorian times, and back then they also had dukes and duchesses, and they also had a huge amount of class conflict and class barriers. Think about the class barriers that you see in London, for example. Think about Percy Shelley talking about class barriers through Ozymandias, this historical figure. So those two would be really good poems to compare this to, just because all three poems really look at class and look at kind of the power structures of class, and all three poets are also present in a time where class is such a huge barrier. The difference between the rich and the poor is so huge, and so there's this kind of difference in power. And in the Victorian times, the time when Browning was writing, there was a huge difference in power. There was a huge amount of class and jealousy and sneaky things that would go on behind these doors, these aristocratic doors. So that's, I think, an important thing to note, that even though this poem is a historical poem, it's not necessarily true. I mean, we don't know whether the Duke was actually like this. He probably wasn't so nefarious and evil in his speech, but Browning obviously takes this real historical figure and this real conspiracy back in that time and presents it in his present time, so in 1842, and he actually, in doing so, tackles a very real and present issue about class. So even though it is a historical poem, there is, in Browning's time, a huge amount that aristocrats got away with, especially aristocratic men, dukes and viscounts and barons. If you were part of the aristocracy, you would probably get away with a lot more than a middle class or lower class person would get away with. So just take that and note it down, that it was a historical poem set in 1500s, right? And Italy as well. That's actually when the poem was set, in 1500s Italy. But Browning's time, was mid-Victorian So that's an important thing to note. So anyway, I was talking about power and class before I went off on one. And these two kind of intermingle throughout the poem. And of course, we've got this idea that I was bringing up, how power and class is still present in Browning's time. And it's something that's been passed on. It's like an ancient tradition. And I think even though this poem is a historical poem, it's set in the past, the reader of Browning's time would have related very heavily to this idea of an evil duke. You know, he's definitely evil and presented as such. He's presented as arrogant. And again, we've got this theme of arrogance. So these two kind of really combine together to create this idea of who the Duke of Ferrara is and how he's presented, most importantly, in the poem. He's a fictional character based off a very real person. And it seems like Browning has a lot of fun with this fictional, arrogant, evil, powerful Duke. And the Duke himself is very obsessed with class throughout the whole poem. There's this idea that the Duchess, who he is talking about, yes, that's his wife, but he never really refers to her by her name. What is her name even? We don't even know. I think historically her name is Lucretia. That's who the real Duchess was, who this poem is based on, but again, we never know. And Browning leaves her name out in this poem on purpose, as if her whole identity is cancelled out by her station in life as a duchess. But interestingly enough, even though she is a duchess and she holds that kind of position in class, it's my last duchess. And remember, this is from the Duke's point of view, so this possessive pronoun we have, my last duchess, really rings through, and it's even in the title, and suggests that she is a duchess only in name. And yes, she is high up in class, but that's only because she is married to the Duke. And she never even has a name because it seems like her identity is unimportant. It's her station in life that's more important. And even more importantly than that, it's the fact that she has achieved her station in life because she is married to the Duke. And there's this definite idea that marriage, it's not a partnership, is it? It's more like possession. And so, again, we've got this theme which links very closely to this idea with jealousy and possessiveness, and the Duke displays a lot of jealousy and possessiveness. He is very possessive over the Duchess, and at the end his jealousy and possessiveness actually causes him to murder the Duchess. And again, like I said, that is implied, but it's very, very obvious through the language that Browning uses that the Duke has murdered the Duchess and that he is the cause of the Duchess's death, and that is how she becomes his last Duchess. We've got this very interesting theme, which I haven't included on here, but the theme of kind of gender as well. What do women mean to this Duke? And I think it's really interesting that throughout the poem, the Duke, he is not quite obvious, and nothing in the poem is obvious. It's all implied. So I'm going to write that down. So the Duke's jealousy is never obvious, but it is implied through the language. He says on line 29, broken the orchid for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all in each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. She thanked men good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. And I know it's a bit of a complicated thing to decipher, but basically what the Duke is saying here is that he was jealous of the Duchess. He was jealous of the fact that she would smile at everyone. He was jealous of the fact that she treated everyone, even the workers, even the servants, equally. He believes that the Duchess should have been grateful for him making her a Duchess in the first place. He's saying, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name. What he's saying here is that he believes the fact that he married the Duchess and made her a Duchess in the first place is a gift that she should be grateful for, and that she should assimilate, which means adapt to being a Duchess and not smile at any of the servants because she should act above them. Now, the Duchess, the last Duchess, who the Duke is talking about, refused to do that. She wanted to treat everyone equally, and so that caused the Duke to become very angry. It caused him to become very jealous of the people she smiled at. It caused him to ultimately kill the Duchess. So the jealousy and possessiveness, which we'll analyse a lot more in the language video, it really shines through, and it really is reflected in the Duke's arrogance. Now, the Duke is a very arrogant man. He's presented as such, and I want to combine this theme of arrogance with this theme of communication, because it is through the Duke's communication skills And remember, he is talking to a servant of the count whose daughter he intends to marry. He is talking in direct address, and the poem is a dramatic monologue. But essentially, it is through his communication, and he's talking about his last duchess, but he is essentially revealing more about himself than he is about his duchess. So he is revealing who he is, right? And it's interesting because the poem is about someone else. It's about the Duke's last duchess. But as it reveals itself more and more, we begin to discover more about the Duke rather than the Duchess. The Duchess is almost, it's quite simple who the Duchess was. She was just a nice woman who enjoyed smiling at people, and she was quite simple. She was just, you know, an ordinary woman who, like anyone else, smiled at people. But what we discover about the Duke is that he is actually a very, very evil man, and his sense of arrogance really shines throughout the language, and his sense of possessiveness over the Duchess, his treatment of her as an object through the language he uses, through the metaphors that are invoked in the poem, really suggest that he, the Duke, is a very evil man and capable of murder. I think what's most interesting about this, and again we've got this theme of death, but I think what's most interesting about this poem is how, even though we don't know whether the Duke killed the Duchess or not, we begin to believe as the poem goes on that he is capable of murder, he is capable of anything. And we've got this theme of gender, remember, he actually believes that his wife is his possession. So this possessiveness, it's not just simply possessiveness. The jealousy is not simply jealousy. It's this belief that the Duke is so high in rank that he is able to get away with anything, that if the Duchess doesn't follow what the Duke follows, if the Duchess doesn't display the same kind of arrogance that the Duke displays, then he is capable of killing her. So yes, one theme that I actually haven't written as well, which I think is quite important, is art and culture. So I'm going to just write that here. So there is this sneaky theme of art and culture. Now, remember, the poem is based off the Duke's direct address towards the servant, but he is looking at a picture of his last duchess, right? So she's this big painting of the last duchess. That's my last duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. So there's this painting of the Duchess that they're both looking at, and the Duke is narrating the story of the Duchess and why she was this, that, or the other, what she was like. So this is all based off a piece of artwork. The Duke is looking at the painting and saying, "Wilt please you sit and look at her? I said, for our panned off by design, for never read, blah, blah, blah. But to myself they turn, since none puts by the curtains I have drawn for you but I." So the Duke, imagine, has opened up some curtains and he's showing the servant and he's saying to the servant, but no one gets to look at this picture, this painting of the Duchess but me, because I control the curtains. I control who gets to see the Duchess. I get to see the Duchess all the time. She is basically embedded in this painting. So not only has the Duke killed the Duchess, but he's got this painting of her that he keeps on the wall that he shows to people. It's all under his control who gets to see her painting. So through art and culture, we've got this very interesting match with the rest of the themes, a match with how the Duke displays his possessiveness over the Duchess, over who gets to see her and who she gets to smile to, in a way, even after her death. So the Duke is the one in total control over the Duchess's face, over her body. So there's this idea that through the art, through the painting of the Duchess, the Duke still gets to control who looks upon her. And so he remains possessive of her even after her death. Through this artwork, we get an even deeper and scarier idea of how possessive, how jealous, how arrogant, and how powerful this Duke is. Okay, so some contextual information about Robert Browning, and the first thing that is the most important, well, one of the most important ones, is that he was very deeply in love with his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and she was also a writer. So she actually wrote a couple of things, well, more than a couple. She was actually a poet, and if you look at your Love and Relationships anthology, she actually has written one of the poems, "How Do I Love Thee?" So yes, she was a poet herself. She was actually invalid, which means that she couldn't leave the house. And I think it's very important to note that Robert Browning, was very in love with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and they had quite a happy marriage. I definitely think that influenced a lot of his writing. She influenced a lot of his writing. Robert Browning specialised a lot of his poetry on murder, and even if you look at My Last Duchess, there's hints of murder, there's intrigue, there's death, there's a very cruel husband who doesn't seem to value or love his wife. There's a lot of gender issues underlying My Last Duchess and a lot of the other poets that he wrote about this idea of gender and feminism and what women mean to men. And I think it's very interesting that Robert Browning himself had a very good relationship with his wife. He took care of her when she was ill, and she was ill a lot of her life. He made sure that she was secure. They moved to Italy together because of the climate. It was a lot better for her and her health. They had one son together, and he actually didn't remarry straight away after she passed away. He really did love his wife, from what it seems, and they had a really rebellious relationship because Elizabeth Barrett's dad did not want her to marry, and he was against the idea of marriage, so she actually was disinherited from him and ran away with Robert Browning to get married. So there's this real kind of loving side to him, and really he did believe in relationships, and he was very good to his wife, and he was actually a feminist himself. So I think that definitely reflects in My Last Duchess. When we think about we think about the content of My Last Duchess, we think about the perspective. When we think about the point of view of My Last Duchess, we see that it is from the perspective of the Duke. And the Duke, well, he is quite far from a feminist as you can get. He doesn't value the women in his life. He doesn't seem to value anyone but himself, but he especially doesn't seem to value women. He values his wife as an object, and there's even this implication near the end of the poem that he believes that his new wife will be nothing but an object to him. Hence, he asks for a dowry. Now, a dowry is basically, for those who don't know, sorry, I should have explained it sooner. A dowry is basically when a man asks a woman for essentially money or a gift of some sort for marrying her. So it's as if the woman comes with additional money, as if she's an object. The groom, the husband, gets money in exchange for having the wife, if that makes sense. So a dowry is basically a very sexist tradition. It's outlawed now in a lot of countries because it is so sexist. The Duke asking for a dowry at the end of the poem is really suggestive of the fact that he is a very sexist and misogynistic man. And I'm going to write that down. Misogynistic. And misogynistic is basically when someone hates women. That's pretty much what it is. Browning wasn't. He was a feminist. Browning believed that women were equal to men. And what's interesting about the ending of My Last Duchess and the Duke asking for a dowry was that Browning definitely didn't ask for a dowry, and he didn't receive one because him and his wife Elizabeth Barrett Browning ran away together, and her dad didn't approve of the marriage. It's unlikely that Browning would have asked, wanted, or received a dowry in the first place. Now, back in the Victorian times and before that, dowries were very, very common in aristocratic families. It's like when a rich woman marries a rich man, her father will give the man a dowry as a way of saying thank you for taking her off my hands, basically. So that's what would happen very commonly in aristocratic circles. And of course, Browning obviously disapproved of that. He has this villainous character, the Duke, in My Last Duchess, who is asking for a dowry, explicitly showing how wrong asking for a dowry is and how wrong everything the Duke seems to do is in general. So yes, Browning, very, very different to the Duke and a lot of the characters in his poems. So that's interesting, I think, because it explores a lot of different ideas, and it shows how Browning is capable of escaping from his own personality and escaping from what he personally is and delving into that realm of fiction, delving into exploring different personalities. Now, in the case of My Last Duchess, Browning is clearly exploring a very dangerous, powerful, arrogant, almost psychotic personality. The Duke is almost mentally unstable and how possessive he is, and it goes to show how mentally unstable he is by the fact that he ends up killing the Duchess, who is nothing but kind and happy and radiates positivity. Now, a lot of Browning's poems circled around the idea of something called fidelity, and what fidelity means is faithfulness, basically. So the idea of faithfulness between married couples. A lot of his poems also focused on women. So, of course, he was a feminist. So, there was a lot of poems which focused on women and control. And a lot of his poems also focused on social class. So, a lot of his poems did address very relevant topics, but he was also a very avid writer of historical poems. And it wasn't just My Last Duchess that was one of his historical poems. He also wrote a very, very famous poem called The Ring in the Book. So that was published after his wife died in 1868 to 1869. And I think this was one of his, well, probably his most famous poem. It was like literally so long. It wasn't even like My Last Duchess, which is tiny compared to this poem. It was a big old epic poem which focused on a real event that happened. So very similar to My Last Duchess. It was a real event that happened in, I think, the 1500s or so, and of course also set in Italy, just like My Last Duchess is. And remember, Robert Browning and his wife did live in Italy for a while, so they definitely had that focus on Italy, and they were very interested in Italy and Italian history. So The Ring in the Book was focused on Italy as well. It was a historical thing that happened whereby essentially a rich man married a woman who he thought was rich but ended up actually being quite poor. Now this rich woman, while she was married to this rich man, ended up cheating on him. So again, we've got this idea of fidelity, faithfulness. She cheated on him and ran away from him, and the rich man got so angry when he found out that she cheated, and on top of that he found out that she wasn't rich and her parents lied to him about her station in life. Actually, she was born off a very lower class family, and they lied to him in order to get him to take her in, that he actually killed her parents as an act of revenge. So that is what essentially the poem is about. There's a lot more to it, and you can absolutely Google it if you want. But yes, this very kind of focus on women and their freedom and their rise in class. And think about My Last Duchess and how this connects. There's this real idea that perhaps the Duchess isn't part of the Duke's social class, because she does smile at everyone, because she does have this very positive mindset, and she smiles at all the servants, and the Duke doesn't like that. He says that's not what a duchess should be like. And he also, remember, says that his gift to her is the fact that he marries her. So he believes that she should be grateful, and the fact that she is smiling at everyone, the fact that she is positive, the fact that she is genuinely a kind person, the Duke believes that that means that she is ungrateful and should be murdered. So there's this definite idea, even though it's not fully written down in the poem, but there's this idea that the Duchess in the poem has risen in rank, that she was perhaps of a lower class, and that the Duke married her and she became a Duchess of a higher class, but she was never really able to adapt to being higher class, and that's really what the Duke hated about her. And again, this idea of control, this idea that rich men, aristocratic men especially, dukes especially, believed that they could control every aspect around them, and there's this kind of real psychopathic idea. And again, The Ring in the Book really explores this psychopathic idea that men of a certain position have a certain arrogance, which eventually blinds them to justice and eventually leads them into murdering people. And so The Ring in the Book is very interesting because it explores murder and death. And this murder and death is done by a rich man. Think about also the fact that Browning wrote Porphyria's lover. Now, if you're here on this video, then most likely you are doing the Power and Conflict cluster in your anthology, but if you swipe a few pages back, you should encounter a poem called Porphyria's Lover, and if you look underneath the title, you'll see that Robert Browning has written Porphyria's Lover, and that is a poem, again, which explores this idea of possessiveness. So again, this idea of men in general, so maybe not higher class men all the time, but men in general being very possessive and controlling, linking to Robert Browning's interest in feminism, in women and class, and women and how they eventually end up, no matter what social position they're in. I mean, think about the Duchess in My Last Duchess. She is actually a duchess, and her class position is very highlighted in the title even. She doesn't even have a name. That's how important her class position is, that she is a duchess. It doesn't matter though. Just like Porphyria, who is higher up in class, just like the Duchess in My Last Duchess, both women end up being killed by the men who are supposed to protect them, who are supposed to love them. So yes, this is very interesting exploration of women in general. And yeah, Browning's interest in this really stems into a lot of his poems. Okay, so a lot of Browning's writing was written in something called the dramatic monologue, where you basically have one perspective. So essentially you'd have one point of view, just like in My Last Duchess, where the Duke's point of view is the most important one. It's from his point of view, and as the story goes on, you realize that he is the villain of the story through his point of view, through his misguided beliefs, through his very wrong and evil tone and language that he chooses to use. You start to realize that actually, even though the poem is written in the Duke's point of view, the Duke is not the hero of the story. So Browning loved to write dramatic monologues from a very faulty point of view. So the character was very faulty, just like the Duke. A lot of the characters were wrong. As the reader read the poem, they would realize that the character perspective was off. So as the reader read the poem, they would realize that the character's perspective was off. They would realize that there was something wrong with that main character narrating their story or narrating the poem. So Robert Browning really liked writing from an ironic perspective. So basically, his poems were very ironic. They would have, for example, in My Last Duchess, a point of view, a character who was flawed, but he wouldn't tell you that that character was flawed. It wasn't like, oh, the Duke is evil, we should all hate him. No, it would be from that point of view, and the reader would slowly read and read and read and realize that the speaker of the poem was the one at fault, and that would kind of unveil mixed emotions. So Browning really enjoyed this kind of unveiling of emotions. That's what he really specialized in, and I guess in that sense he really enjoyed psychology, the psychology of the reader, as the reader realizes that the character or that the speaker who they are most intimate with, whose point of view that they are reading, whose brain that they're basically in for the length of that poem, is slowly very alien to them or very evil. So when we read My Last Duchess at first, he calls the servant sir. There's this very kind of polite, nice tone that he has. But as the poem unveils and we, get more into the poem, we realize that the Duke is actually a big old raging psychopath, and he's evil, and we don't like him very much. By the end of the poem, we really shouldn't like the Duke, because Browning doesn't like the Duke, and he doesn't put the Duke up for us to like him. He puts the Duke up for us to slowly realize that there is something very wrong with this character. So there's this real psychological aspect where we are very close to the speaker of the poem. Immediately we are in their brains, but we slowly start to realize that there's something wrong with them. So it's up to the reader to really decide. Browning doesn't give us any hints other than through tone and through language. So that was what Browning loved to do in his poems. He loved to write dramatic monologues from very flawed perspectives. And actually, his poem, The Ring and the Book, was from many different perspectives, some more flawed than others. So there's this real juggling with different perspectives that Browning really enjoyed in a lot of his works. And I think it's very good to take that idea that Browning really favoured dramatic monologues and put it into your essay when you are writing about My Last Duchess. This idea that the Duke is a flawed character, but we are reading the poem from his perspective. That's very important because we're very close to the Duke in that moment. We start to see who he really is from a very intimate point of view. It is his point of view, it's his brain. Even though he is fictional, we are allowed into his fictional mind, and we're able to see, as readers, how wrong he is. Okay, and lastly, looking at the structure of the poem is a dramatic monologue. It's written from one perspective, and it's a direct address, and it's almost like a speech. It is actually a speech. So it is a speech in the form of a poem. And actually, the dramatic monologue comes from theatre. So if you've ever done a Shakespeare play, you'll probably know what a dramatic monologue is, when one of the characters kind of stands, faces the audience, and says a big whole chunk of speech, essentially. Now, Browning was very close to theatre. He actually started off as a playwright at the beginning of his career, or maybe a few points throughout his career. He was familiar with a lot of theatre, and he was a playwright at one point in his life, so he was no stranger to the dramatic monologue. He actually became a big fan of the dramatic monologue and the exploration of characters and perspectives, and the way that the reader connected with the character who was giving that dramatic monologue, and how close the reader was to that character, and how that reader begins to create their own judgments based on what that character is saying, essentially. So yes, there is this idea, this speech aspect, this performance aspect, I guess you could say, because dramatic monologues were so closely linked to actors on a stage, we can very easily say that the Duke himself is perhaps an actor. He is very, very good at manipulating and using language to manipulate, and he's very good at pretending, isn't he? Look at the noun sir, which he uses quite a lot to refer to the servant. Now, the Duke is very, very much brimming in arrogance. He is a very arrogant man. He knows exactly what his station is. So why the hell would he refer to someone lower than him in station as sir? Well, he's obviously acting, isn't he? He's obviously, being a bit ironic, being a bit greasy. He's almost kind of convincing the servant that he's a really nice guy, but he's not. His language very much contrasts his tone. So as he is being very polite and referring to this man as sir, even though he is a duke, he's higher up, there's this sense that he is doing it almost in a funny way. He's doing it in order to grease up the servant and make him like him, make him favour him. And we realise later on in the poem that the Duke has a reason for this, a reason which benefits him. There's a reason for every single thing that the Duke does in this poem, and there's a reason for every single language feature that Browning gives to the Duke as he speaks, as he makes his speech. And it all kind of cements this idea that the Duke himself is an actor, he's in a play, he's not a genuine human being, he's not anything close to being a genuine human being. He is simply an actor doing what he needs to do in order to get his point across, in order to benefit him, and in order to kind of be selfish, really. While it is a speech, while it is a kind of dramatic speech, and there's this sense that the speech has been written for the Duke, as if it's been constructed for the Duke, and the Duke is simply playing a part, this is further reinforced by the rhyme scheme of the poem. And now you might not have realised, I certainly didn't, but there is a rhyme scheme in the poem. Look, we've got wall, call, hands, stand, said, read, countenance, glance, by, eye, durst, first. I could go on. Not, spot, perhaps lapse, paint, faint. We've got this real rhyme scheme, this rhythm to the poem. And I definitely think there's a reason for this rhythm, and I think it really matches up to this idea that the Duke is playing a part, that he is an actor, that the speech is almost written out for him. If you look at some of your other poems, there is this sense of informality, of spontaneousness, perhaps by some of the language that's used, perhaps there's a couple of contractions in there which give the poem more of a human aspect to them, perhaps the rhyme scheme is very scattered and so it's not quite as orchestrated or planned out. Now this poem has the exact opposite effect. The rhyme scheme is very calculated, it has a calculated rhythm, it's very structured. Now, first of all, this rhyme scheme being very structured could represent this idea of the Duke's life being very structured, and the Duke himself needing a lot of structure in his life. There's this very cold aspect to the Duke, that he can't even tolerate having a Duchess who smiles at other people, because that is too much for him in his cold, empty life. And so this structure really represents the Duke's life, the Duke's standards, that he needs to have precision, he needs to have control over every aspect of his life. Again, there is also this idea that the rhyme scheme really reflects this idea of something being very calculated, that perhaps the Duke has written out this speech for himself, and that he has included this rhyme scheme in order to give this sense of poetry in his speech. The rhyme scheme gives the poem a sense that the Duke has not spontaneously said what he said. Nothing he's saying is from the heart. It's all calculated and planned out. The rhyme scheme is planned out beforehand, and so it gives a sense, again, of tightness, of control, of precision, that everything that the Duke does has to be planned out beforehand. It has to be manipulated. And of course, I think what's really, really cool about this is that the rhyme scheme is in pairs. It's in couplets almost. Walk, call, hand, stand, said, read. It's in kind of, rhyming pairs. A, B, B. So a sense of rhyming couplets, which I think really reflects the idea of marriage, as marriage is a couple, isn't it? So there's this kind of constant thread, this idea of couples being together, right? Which is directly contrasting the actual content of the poem, which is not about a couple really. It's about a single man so in power, so filled with greed and arrogance, that he will never ever be able to live in a couple. And there's this sense that he values himself above anyone else, and so he could never be part of a couple. He can only be himself with a bunch of servants around him, one of them being his wife. And also, of course, there's this idea of couples being broken apart in the actual content, because the Duke ends up murdering his wife, or having her murdered. So yes, this very ironic rhyme scheme where we've got a couple, couplet rhyme scheme, but actually the actual content is about one singular Duke and his personality. So yeah, there's this real sense of irony in the content, in the structure, and this idea that My Last Duchess might be about the Duchess through the title, but actually ends up being about the Duke and his personality. It's not the Duchess that shines through in this poem, it's the Duke and his evilness which shines through in this poem. That's what the poem is really about. It's about the Duke. So everything in this poem, I think, is very, very ironic, and it's done on purpose in order to make the reader think one thing at the beginning and actually realise another thing at the end. And you realise slowly that the Duke himself is an actor. He is putting on a performance. He is essentially fake. He is essentially not honest at all about anything. And that really shines through with the structure of a dramatic monologue, with the structure of the rhyme scheme, which makes it seem like there's some kind of fake rhythm to it instead of a natural, spontaneous, informal speech. And of course, at the end, you've got that big old metaphor about Neptune taming a seahorse, which really solidifies this idea of control that the Duke has throughout the whole poem. He needs to have such control over every aspect of his life that even his speech is brimming with control, with arrogance, with a need to tame, with a need to really have a handle on what he is saying. So there we go. Context, structure, all hopefully analysed and all hopefully absorbed.